Okay, good evening, everybody. We're continuing with the book of First Corinthians. This will be part two. The first part we went all the way through chapter 10, and as a review, just to remind everybody that Corinth is a city that is very huge on idolatry. They had a lot of pagan temples, and so what's going on? Paul is writing this letter because the people with whom he had started a congregation, remember that Paul had been in Corinth approximately 18 months. And so the people that he had already ministering to were both Jews and non-Jews. But when he writes this letter is because the people, especially the non-Jews that have come to believe in Messiah, now they're going back to their old habits. And so what he's dealing with is people going back to idolatry, people having disputes and taking them to courts instead of using their own judicial system, the Sanhedrin. They're having issues with people eating foods that have been offered up to idols. And so there's a lot of stuff going on that shouldn't be happening. And there's also the disparity between the rich believers and the non-rich believers, the more poor that have to work. And so I think I mentioned last time that the people that are rich, they see manual labor as something wrong. They don't believe in manual labor, and they kind of look people that do that. Remember that Paul also did manual labor because that was a way of him financially sustaining himself, because he didn't want to receive from the congregation any financial help. He wanted to do it on his own. And so he's dealing with all these things and certain issues that are going on that the people should not be doing, and they're doing it. So in this chapter 11, the issue that comes up is about headship and coverings, especially about, and many times we've probably heard that people use this chapter for discussions that really are incorrect because they're taking it out of context. Now, let's go to verse 2 of chapter 11. It says, "Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firm the traditions just as I passed them on to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Messiah, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Messiah is God." Now, what you have to understand what he's saying here when he says the head of a man or of a woman or of a Messiah, he's talking about authority and also a source, the source of life or the source of resources. It's someone that covers you and has authority over you, but not in authority in the sense when he says here that the man, that the head of the woman is the man, is not in the sense that the man has authority to treat her as less than him. It has to do with authority in terms of being a source of help, a source of income, a source to help the woman. And so in terms of man, Messiah is above man in the sense also in that way that man depends on Messiah as his guide, as his source, as his life ship, as his authority that guides him and helps him through life. So it has nothing to do with being submitting to a point that the person is mistreated or seen as someone of less value. And then he goes in verse 4, he says, "Every man praying or prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head." Now, you have to understand the context of the culture that's going on in Corinth during this time. Remember that Corinth has both Greek and Roman culture. And you also have to remember that in the temple, the priest that served the Lord had to cover their heads. So the priesthood and the Levites could not minister in the temple without having their heads covered. So if Paul is saying here, every man praying or prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head, is he going against Torah? No. If you don't know the context, you're going to misinterpret and think that Paul is going against what the Torah says about Levites and priests having their heads covered. In the Roman culture, now we have to understand that in Corinth there were a lot of pagan temples and a lot of statues and a lot of places where people could go and pray to their gods. So the Romans had the custom that any man, and remember this is being done in public, any man that prayed to their gods, their Roman gods or their Greek gods, had to cover their heads. So when Paul is telling the men, the believers of Messiah, not to cover their heads in public, is because if they, for whatever reason, they decide to pray to Adonai and they cover their heads, the people around them is going to think that they're praying not to Adonai, but to the Roman and Greek gods, because that is part of their culture. So Paul says you don't do that. If you're going to pray, you go to the temple in the proper place and you cover your head there, or if you're going to do some prophesying, you cover your head there, or in the synagogue. But in public, you don't do it because they're going to relate it that you're praying to the Roman or the Greek gods. And another thing is that it says, but every man, every woman, verse 5, praying or prophesying with her head uncovered, dishonors her head. Again, this is a cultural thing. In the Middle East, even till this day, in the Middle East, and then, for example, in Israel, all the married Jewish Orthodox women, and even some of conservative women, Jewish women, if they're married, they cover their hair. They always have a covering. As a matter of fact, there's some group of Jewish women that they don't cover their hair, but they use a wig. Okay, so their hair, why? Because even in this time, the hair of women was considered something sensual. And many of them, once they were married, they believed that their hair, their beauty was something for their husbands to look at and not anybody else. So the custom was, if you're married, you wore a covering on your head. The Roman women during this time, especially the rich women, because they had the resources, they would go to the beauty and have their hairdos fixed and use jewels and stuff, and they would have their beautiful hair. And so they wanted to show off their hair and show off that they had money and show off that they had the resources, so they wouldn't cover their hairs. And another thing was that it was associated, a woman that did not cover her hair was usually a loose woman. So she had her hair loose and long because it was sensual. So when a woman walked around with her hair loose, they understood that she was looking for a special relationship. Okay? Remember, this is the culture here and then. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is our culture. But even today, especially the Muslim women, the Jewish women that are married cover their hairs because it has to do with modesty, and it has to do that they show that they're married. And we have to remember that during this time in the first century, clothing would give an idea of your status, social status, and also would give an idea of if you were single, if you were married, if you were a widow, if you were a loose woman, if you were looking for somebody. It all depended on how you dressed. They could tell by just how you dressed. So in terms of women, not having their hair covered had to do with modesty and meant that they were maybe a prostitute or looking for sexual favors. For it is one and the same as having been shaved. In other words, a person, especially a woman that had her head shaved, was shameful. So if you have your hair loose, and let's say you're married, you're bringing shame not only to yourself, but you're bringing shame to your husband and to your family. So that's the way it was understood culturally and in public. Another thing that having your hair covered was and during this time, what they would say is wild hair. A man that had wild hair was the following. A man with wild hair was a man that had hair so long that it was almost as long as a woman's hair during that time. Now, a man having hair that long was associated with homosexuality. So even when because people don't understand this, and for some reason, I don't know where they got it from, probably from all these Roman pictures that we see of Yeshua, remember they usually, the way they picture Yeshua is having long hair, usually blonde, blue-eyed, and wearing a white toga with a red uh, uh, something over it, red, like the Romans. That is Roman clothing. Yeshua would never wear that. So when you see a picture of Yeshua wearing those things and with long hair, basically that was the clothing and the appearance of a homosexual during this period. So it is incorrect. Now that if men had hair long, it would be in a form that they could not be confused with a woman. And so for this culture, if a woman had very short hair or her head shaved, it was shameful, because there had to be a marked distinction between a man and a woman based on their hair. So, for example, there's even in the Mishnah, in explaining some of the commandments about the priest and the Levites, it mentions that the Levites and the priests could not have wild hair. A man that had long hair could not go into the temple. So they had to cover their heads if they were serving the Lord, but they could not go in with long hair, because long hair in this time, especially in Corinth, it was associated with homosexuality. Verse 7. For surely a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. So again, it has to do with the representation of how they look. Remember, all this has to do with when they go out in public, and most of the time in the culture, it was the men that were out in public. The women were home taking care of their families. It says, verse 8, for man is not from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. In any case, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. For just as the woman came from the man, so also the man comes from the woman, but all things are from God. In other words, there's, in the eyes of God, there's equality. But you have to also walk in honor. If in the culture, a man having his head covered in public was shameful, it was also shameful for a woman not to have her head covered or to have it shaved. Again, it's a cultural thing. It has to do with honor and shame. Remember, this culture is very big on honor and shame. And in verse 17 forward, what he's talking about is how to deal with what they would call table fellowship. Table fellowship. Table fellowship was something huge during this time, which meant that when you sat at the table, basically you're sitting in covenant, and so you respected the people with whom you sat, and usually you only sat and socially and ate if everybody was in agreement. Now, what's going on here is, in verse 18 of chapter 11 says, for the first of all, when you come together as Messiah's community, I hear that there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it, for there must be factions among you, so that those among you who are tried and true may be evident. Therefore, when you meet together in the same place, it is not to eat a meal of the Lord, for each one takes his own supper beforehand, and one goes hungry while another gets drunk. What it is certainly not that you do not have houses, is it? Don't you have houses to eat and drink? Remember that what's going on is the people are going back to bad habits. What they're doing again, many of these people attended temple banquets, and not the temple of the Lord. They're going to temple banquets of pagan gods. Why? Because let's say they have a friend or they have people of influence, and somebody invites you. Let's say there's a wedding, and the wedding is at a pagan temple, and it was a dishonor if somebody invited you to eat at their house and you said no. So to avoid being dishonorable, they're your friends, even though they believe something else different from you, you go. And it was a custom, especially the people that had money. They did banquets. And it was a custom that they would serve all this food, all the wines, and then eventually it turned into orgies and all these things, and so it was a zoo, and so they were used to that the rich people ate a lot, and if some other people came that weren't as wealthy, they would get the leftovers, and they would be treated like, okay, whatever's left you can eat. We ate the best meat and we ate the best stuff. So what he's saying is, you're coming to sit at a table on Shabbat, or you're coming to sit together as a Messianic community, and you're doing the same things you were doing before. You cannot do that at the table when the table represents the altar of the Lord. If you're celebrating Shabbat, your table becomes like the altar of the temple. You just cannot sit there and do the same things you used to do in pagan temples. It's not the same thing. You respect each other. And so he goes and he says in verse 23, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Yeshua, on the night he was betrayed, took matzah, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in memory of me.'" So he's talking about Passover. Now you have to remember that when this verse that it says, "Do this in memory of me," has been misunderstood by Christianity and also Catholicism, because they do communion every Sunday, or some churches do communion every month, every week. And Passover is communion, but Passover is once a year. You don't do this whenever you want to. So he's saying you cannot treat the table of Passover like you would treat any other banquet or any other temple banquet. He says, because you have to understand that when you're eating the matzah, it represents the body of Messiah. When you're drinking the wine, it represents the blood of Messiah of the new covenant. And you do this only once a year. Passover is only once a year. Verse 27, "Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the Lord's cup in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord." Why? Because if you come and sit down to celebrate Passover and you treat it like any other meal, or you treat it like if you were in a pagan temple, you're dishonoring what it means. If the bread represents the sacrifice of Messiah and the wine represents the blood, you're basically not having any honoring God, and you're shaming yourself, and this can cause issues physically, because he says, "But a man," verse 28, "but a man must examine himself, and then let him eat of the bread and drink from the cup." In other words, you have to do an introspection to make sure that when you're doing this, you're doing it with the right motive, with the right understanding. "For the one who eats and drinks without recognizing the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and quite a few have died." So, in other words, there is, in a way, a punishment for doing this if you don't understand what you're doing, because you just can't treat Passover like any other meal and and just come in and eat whatever you want, whenever you want. And there's an order. In Passover, there's a Seder, there's an order. Verse 31, "For if we were judging ourselves thoroughly, we wouldn't be coming under judgment. But when we are judged, we are being disciplined by the Lord, so that we might not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat home, so that when you meet, it doesn't lead to judgment, and the rest I will put in order when I come." So there has to be an order when people did table fellowship, whether they're celebrating Shabbat, whether they're celebrating a festival, a Passover. There's an order, there's respect, there's honor, because when you sit down, you represent the altar of the Lord. What's called the table of the Lord is the altar, like when they're in the temple. And I think we mentioned last time that one of the things that would happen was because of all the temples in Corinth, there was a lot of idol worship and a lot of sacrifices. And they would treat these things, they would eat the meat, and if there was any leftover meat, they would sell it to the markets, to the meat markets. Now, the people that usually ate the most meat were the people that had money. The poor people ate meat only on special occasions or when they were able to afford it. So the rich people would buy this meat, and the poor people would get always the worst, the leftovers, whatever was left over. And so when Paul is talking about this, he's basically referring to the non-Jewish people, because the Jews, when they were a large community like in Corinth, they would have their own kosher butchery. So whatever they ate, they knew was kosher. But the other people, even though they're believers in Messiah, they're non-Jews, but they're still going to eat and buying all this food that's being offered to idols. So this has to do with table fellowship, which was very common during this time, and there were some rules that had to be followed, especially in public, because again, remember that public had to do with the honor or the shame of the people. In chapter 12, what he's talking about is spiritual gifts. And he's saying that the Holy Spirit is the one that distributes all these gifts, and they're given freely to the people, in the sense that it's God who decides to give what gift to what person. And the thing about chapter 12, he's trying to explain that all these gifts that God gives to people is not for personal use, is to use it within the community. Because the purpose of these gifts, even though they're diverse, is so that all can be used as one body to benefit the whole community. So the purpose of all these gifts is to edify and to help the community, and not for themselves. In verse 4 it says, of chapter 12, now there are various kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are various kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are various kinds of working, but the same God who works all things in all people. But to each person is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the benefit of all. For to one is given through the Spirit a word of wisdom, to another a word of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healings by the one Spirit, to another workings of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another different kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. But one and the same Spirit activates all these things, distributing to each person individually as he wills. In other words, he's saying all these gifts. Some people have the gifts of healing. Some people have the gifts of knowledge, understanding situations. Some have the spirit of the gift of tongues or interpreting tongues. Some have the gift of prophecy. Some have the gifts of teaching. And so it's gifts given by the same Spirit to people, however the Spirit wants to give them. But the purpose is for the community. In verse 12, he says, for just as the body is one and has many parts, and all the parts of the body, though many, are one body, so also is Messiah. For in one Spirit we were all immersed into one body, whether Jewish or Greek, slave or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. So he uses the physical body as an example to show us that, imagine if our bodies were all hands. Are we going to be useful? Absolutely not. Or if our body were all feet. So he says, even though we have different parts of our bodies with different functions, together they make the body one to be able to be functional and to fulfill its purpose. So he says that some of these gifts is for the purpose of bringing honor to the community. In verse 27, he describes, now you are the body of Messiah and members individually. God has put into his community first emissaries, which is another word for apostle, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then healings, leadership, various kinds of tongues. All are not emissaries, are they? All are not prophets, are they? All are not teachers, are they? All do not work miracles, do they? All do not have the gifts of healing, do they? All do not speak in tongues, do they? All do not interpret, do they? But earnestly desire the greater gifts. So everybody has basically a purpose, a function, a role within the body. Not everybody can be all teachers. Not all of them can be worship leaders, because then the body of Messiah, the community, would not work. So we have pastors, we have teachers, we have singers, we have musicians, we have prophets, we have healers. So all these ministries are gifts that come from the Lord for the purpose of blessing and unifying the body of Messiah. But then he mentions that there's a greater gift that we should all try to have, and he calls this love. He says that love is the greatest gift of all that people should have. And he starts mentioning in chapter 13, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels but not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I own, if I hand over my body so I might boast, but have not love, I gain nothing. And then he does the description of what love is. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not brag, it is not puffed up, it does not behave inappropriately, it does not seek its own way, it is not provoked, it keeps no account of wrong, it does not rejoice over injustice, but rejoices in the truth, it bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, it endures all things. Love never fails. So if you look at all these characteristics of love, basically he's describing God. These are attributes of God. Because remember that in one of the books of John, John says that God is love. So basically having love the way that is described here in chapter 13 is showing the same attributes that God has towards us. And he mentions that in verse 9, for we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect has come, then that which is partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. And remember that the mirrors during this time were not like the mirrors we have today. They were made out of bronze, and so even though that you looked at a mirror, you didn't really see yourself clearly. So he's saying this is the way it is right now, because there's going to be a time when we will see God face to face, and then we will really see clearly who he is and who we are in him. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. But now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And why does he mention this? Because we remember that all the stuff that's going on in the community. They're fighting with each other. They're saying, oh no, I belong to Apollo. No, I belong to Paul. They're having disputes. They're going to the Roman courts to settle these things. They're treating the people that are more poor worse than the rich ones. They're giving preference to the rich people. The women that are rich, they do all these hairdos. They don't wear cover their heads. They're not being modest. So there's a lot of stuff going on that so he says, but above all things, have love and have patience and treat each other well, and do not do the things that you were accustomed to in this culture. In chapter 14, what he's talking about basically is about order when the community meets. And he says in verse 1, pursue love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to people, but to God, for no one understands, but in the Spirit he speaks mysteries. Now, some people don't believe in the gift of tongues. I do believe in the gift of tongues, and it's kind of hard to explain, but your spirit starts speaking in a language that you do not understand yourself, but your spirit does, and it's like a spiritual communication between your spirit and the Spirit of God. Now, what he says in this chapter basically is, if you're in the community and you have the gift of prophecy and you start prophesying, and one thing that we have to understand, what is prophecy? Prophecy is not foretelling the future. Prophecy is speaking the words of God to bring us to repentance and to bring us closer to the Lord. It's a message directly from God through an individual. So he says, if someone prophesies in a language that is not understood by anybody, there should be someone to interpret that prophecy. Because he says, it's not worth it for people to speak in prophecy and there be no interpretation. And he says, you might as well just shut up or speak to yourself and to God, but don't say anything, because if it's not going to bring understanding, then don't say it. Because he says the following, verse 3, but one who prophesies speaks to people for building up, urging on, and uplifting. Other versions say for building up, for edifying, and for comforting. So the gift of prophecy is for this. The gift of prophecy is not for individuals. The gift of prophecy is for the community, to edify, build up the community, to urge, uplift the community, to encourage, and to comfort the community. Verse 5. Now I want you all to speak in tongues, but even more that you would prophesy. One who prophesies is greater than one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets, so that the community may be built up. But now, brothers and sisters, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you? In other words, he's saying, if I come to you speaking a language that you don't understand, I'm not doing anything. You're not learning anything. You're not receiving any communication. So don't bother. He says it's better to speak 5 words with understanding than to speak 5 words in prophecy and nobody understands what you're saying. Again, it's to build up the community. And so one of the things that was happening is that people were prophesying and doing it in a manner that was not orderly. Please go to verse 26. It says, what is it then, brothers and sisters? Whenever you come together, each one has a psalm, a teaching, a revelation, a tongue, and interpretation. Let all things be done for edification. If someone speaks in a tongue, let it be by 2 or at most 3, and each in turn, and let one interpret. I've been to churches, and this is, of course, in the past, where you would enter, and everybody would be speaking in tongues, and they sounded like a whole bunch of chickens, just blah, 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 blah. And what Paul is saying here, if someone has a word that is a prophecy, it should be done in order. One speaks first, then the second, then the third, and there should be someone to interpret, because it's not going to help anybody if nobody understands what the individual is saying. Verse 28, but if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in the community, but speak to himself and to God. So if you start speaking in words and tongues just to show off, you're not edifying yourself, and you're especially not edifying or honoring the Lord. Verse 29, let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others evaluate. But if something is revealed to another sitting nearby, let the first one become silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so all may learn and be encouraged. And then he says something that, again, I saw this in several churches where you would see people jumping around and prophesying and falling to the floor and hitting somebody or cracking their head on the wall or whatever. That is not order, and that is not prophecy, and that is not the Holy Spirit. I'm sorry. If you have people jumping up and down around and doing things that look more like they're crazy, because he says here, the spirit of the prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not a God of confusion, but of shalom. So when people say, oh, I don't have control of this, that is a lie. So I don't know what spirit or what tongues they're speaking, but it's not the Spirit of God, because the Spirit of God always does things in order. So you just can't go, and of course, I haven't seen this in a Messianic congregation. I'm talking about other places, but the things of the Lord have order. You cannot have a whole bunch of people saying things and say, oh, the Lord said, and the Lord did not say. Or the Lord said, and someone, one thing that I have learned in my walk with the Lord is, if he's going to bring a word to the community, is usually 99.9% times a word of encouragement, a word that edifies, a word that builds up. When somebody stands up and speaks a word that is condemning, a word that is judging, a word that is pulling down people instead of lifting them up, I'm sorry, but that is not the way that the God that I know does things. If God has something to say to rebuke someone, the proper way is you take that person and separately you speak to that person. You don't say it out loud from the altar and proclaim it to the whole world. Oh, so and so did this, so and so did that, or the Lord is revealing to me that, you don't do that. And I've seen churches where that has happened. Because when God speaks, he does it in a way that he honors people. Even if it's a rebuke, he does it in a way not to cause shame to the individual. And they do it, you should do it in private, not in public. Because God is not a God of confusion. And the bringing a word of prophecy is to build up the community, not to tear it down. And then he goes, remember, this chapter has to do with order. So when he starts speaking about women here, unfortunately, again, people take this verse out of context, and this is from where they get women are not to teach in the communities, or women cannot be leaders, or women cannot be pastors. It says, as in all the communities of the holy ones, let women keep silent in the communities, for it is not permitted for them to speak out. So they take that verse out of context because this chapter has to do with order and prophesying. So basically he's saying that women also need to maintain the order. They just can't get up and start speaking out of order because it's not permitted. It's not permitted to men. It's not permitted to women. And another thing is we have to remember that what he's talking, most likely this is in the synagogue, not in the temple. In the temple there was the court of the women, and all the women were there, was all with men and with children. So and they were there and they were speaking and everything was fine. So most likely what he's referring to is in the synagogues, because the same way in the temple, women had their own court and they were separated from the men in other courts within the temple. In the synagogues, and even today, especially the Orthodox synagogues, they sit women on one side and men on one side. And the reason for that is for modesty. For modesty. If you've been to churches these days or to congregations, the way some women dress is unbelievable. It's like you might as well go to a party. And so if you're standing in front of a man and you're wearing clothing that is very sensuous or delineates your body, or you look like you're whatever, you're not helping that brother to concentrate and do what they're supposed to do. So, and I think this is a great idea, honestly. They separate the women and they separate the men. So the issue here was, remember also that in this culture, women were not that they were not allowed, but because of the function of women during this time, the women most of the time were in their homes taking care of their children, cooking, cleaning, making clothes. And so it was the men that went out to the synagogues. It was men that went out to the yeshivas. It was men that went out to the market. It was men that were mostly in public. So women didn't have a lot of opportunity to go out and study like we have today. So the only time they could learn was when they went to the synagogue. So if they're separated from her husband who's sitting down there and you're down here and somebody's saying something and you don't understand and you're screaming from one side, hey honey, what is he saying? That's not permitted. Why? Because you're breaking the order. So what Paul says, so he's referring to this, he's not referring that women cannot teach and that women cannot speak, and that women cannot be pastors, and that women cannot be leaders. This verse has caused so much damage to women in the congregation and the body of Messiah for not understanding what's going on. It's talking about order. If you have them separated and they're screaming from one side of the room to the other, asking her husband, what is he saying? Or somebody else, what are they talking about? Paul says the following. Rather, let them be in order, as the Torah also says. Verse 35, if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home. For it is disgraceful for a woman to speak out in the community. Speak out how? Out of order. Remember, the chapter has to do with order. It has nothing to do that women cannot teach, or women cannot be pastors, or women cannot be leaders. And so he says, he continues saying that in the last verse, it says, verse 40 says, but let everything be done decently and in order. Therefore, this whole chapter has to do with order. If you have a gift of prophecy, gift of tongues, gift of teaching, whatever the Lord has given you is not for you, it's for the community, it's for edifying the community. If you're very good at doing something, that talent or that gift is not for you, it's for the community. So you use it to edify and you use it to build up the body of Messiah, and you do it always in an orderly fashion. Then what's going on in chapter 15 is the question about resurrection. Remember that these people have learned something and now they're going back to their old ways. During this time in this culture, there were three philosophies. There was the philosophy, some that believed in resurrection. There was another group that said there was no resurrection. Remember, the Sadducees were ones that said there was no resurrection. And then there was a group that said there's nothing after you die. So you might as well eat, live, enjoy today because there's nothing else. So the people are going back to that. And so Paul, the question here is about resurrection. And he's saying, he gives a recount of Yeshua after he resurrected, that many, many people saw him. Therefore, there are many witnesses that Yeshua, who the people saw him die, he resurrected, people saw him alive again, they ate with him, they drank with him. Why? Because some of them would say that he was just a ghost. But to show that he was not a ghost, he had food with them, he ate with them, he was there for 40 days. And so he goes to, because he's saying, if now you believe the Messiah did not resurrect, then your faith is worthless. Because if you don't believe Messiah has resurrected, then why even bother? He said, basically, then you're still in your sins because you haven't been forgiven, because if Messiah did not resurrect, then there's really no purpose for our faith. In verse 20, he says, but now Messiah has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Remember that asleep is a reference to death. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also has come through a man. For as in Adam all die, so also in Messiah will all be made alive, but each in his own order. Messiah the first fruits, then at his coming, those who belong to Messiah. Then the end, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all rule and all authority and power. And even in this, he's showing order and a hierarchy. So basically saying the first one to resurrect was Messiah, like a first fruit. He'll come again. And those that have died before Messiah coming back and believing in Messiah will also be lifted up with him. And then he says that what he calls at the end, basically what is the end? When he comes back to rule and reign for 1,000 years, the millennial reign. After he's done that, he says that he, Yeshua, hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all rule and authority and power. After Yeshua has destroyed all rule and authority and power. For he must reign, Yeshua, until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death, because we know that after the millennial reign will be the judgment seat, and after that, those that are condemned will go to wherever they're going, and those that believe in Messiah will rule and reign with Messiah for eternity. So death will be destroyed in the sense that there will be no more death. Verse 27, for God has put all things in subjection under his feet. Whose feet? Yeshua's feet. But when the psalmist says that all has been put in subjection, it is clear that this does not include God himself, who put all things under Messiah. So here he's showing the hierarchy of God as king, as the Father, and Yeshua as king, as Messiah. So even though Yeshua as Messiah is God and God is Messiah, he's talking about their roles. Again, he's not asking us to understand how this works, because for us it's really hard to understand because we're in this body, we're in this dimension, so we don't really grasp. But the thing is, there's a hierarchy. God is the sovereign king and Messiah is the vassal king. God is the Father, Yeshua as the Son. After Yeshua dominates in the millennial reign, he destroys death, he destroys everything else that has nothing to do with God. He offers all this that he has done to the Father, but the Father returns it back to Messiah, because remember, Messiah is going to rule on the earth. But God is the only thing that cannot be under subjection of Messiah. Messiah is under subjection of the Father. Verse 28, now when all things become subject to him, then the Son himself will also become subject to the one who put all things under him, so that God will be all in all. So again, hierarchy, the Son is under submission to the Father. And once everything is given back to the Father will give it back to Messiah. And then he goes, at the end of verse 32, he says, if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Remember, this was one of the beliefs, the philosophies that people had during that time. He says, verse 33, bad company corrupts good morals. In other words, the people that had believed now are being corrupted by or influenced by those that are going back to their old ways. He says, come to your senses as you ought and stop sinning. For some have no knowledge of God. I say this to your shame. But someone will say, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come? Fool, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. As for what you sow, you are not sowing the body that will be, but a bare seed, maybe of wheat or something else. But God gives it a body just as he planned, and to each of the seeds a body of its own. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one flesh of humans, another flesh of animals, another of birds, another of fish. There are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one thing, while the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for one star differs from another star in glory. So also is the resurrection of the dead, sown in corruption, raised in incorruption, sown in dishonor, raised in glory, sown in weakness, raised in power, sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. So the people were asking, okay, so we believe, okay, so there is a resurrection. So how is this going to happen? What am I going to look like? How is it going to be? And still people ask that. Am I going to come back with the same age I died? And I'm going to be looking the same? Will I be renewed? Will I be young again? Will I be thinner? Will I be all these wrinkles where everything will go away? So he's saying basically that everything has its own nature. Like the flesh of fish is different from the flesh of a human. So basically he says that this body, once you die, it's like a seed. This dies, and the seed becomes then another body, what would be what people call a glorified body. In other words, this body, this flesh, cannot go into eternity because this thing dies. It's corrupt. It decays. It gets old. It gets tired. It gets broken. It starts hanging. Everything gets all messed up, right? So he says, so this cannot go into eternity. So therefore, when you resurrect, you'll have a body that will function in eternity. You'll have a body that will not be limited by space, time, or any material. You'll go into a different dimension. So you cannot come up the same way you died. So because you go from corruption to something that's going to be incorrupt. You go from something that is sick and dying to something that comes out beautiful and living and will live forever. So he says, if there is a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. So also it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. The first man is of the earth, made of dust. The second man is from heaven. Because remember Yeshua, after he resurrected, Yeshua had the ability to show up in a closed room. What does that mean? That he was able to go through the walls. Why? Because his body no longer was being subjected to the physical laws of nature. His body was according to the heavenly nature. So that is what we hope for and expect to happen to us. Verse 48, like the one made of dust, so also are those made of dust. And like the heavenly, so also are those who are heavenly. And just as we have borne the image of the one from the dust, so also shall we bear the image of the one from heaven. Now I say this, brothers and sisters, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, and what decays cannot inherit what does not decay. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep. In other words, we shall not all die, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last shofar. Because we know there's going to be a last sound of a shofar, the last shofar. When Yeshua comes back, there will be a sound of a shofar, and those that are dead will be resurrected when they hear the sound. For the shofar will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we will be changed. For this corruptible must be put on incorruptibility, and this mortal must put on immortality. But when this corruptible will have put on incorruptibility, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that it is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? So let's say that we're alive when Yeshua comes back, when that last trumpet sounds. Those that died in him, believing in him, will be resurrected. If we haven't gone through death, we will be changed. Why? Because we're going to be walking directly into eternity, into the millennial reign, with a body that will be adjusted to eternity, not to something. Because if we go into eternity with this body, it's not going to make it. So whether you're dead and resurrect with a glorified body, or you're not dead, but you will be changed, like the word says, in a twinkling of an eye. Why? Because we're being moved to a different dimension when Yeshua comes back. And the last thing to be destroyed will be death. In verse 56 it says, now the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the Torah. How can the Torah be the power of sin? What it's trying to say is that it is the Torah that teaches you what is sin. So in that sense, it's powerful in the sense that only through Torah can you know what is right or what is wrong. It's the Torah that gives us the understanding of sin. And he says in verse 57, but thanks be to God who keeps giving us the victory through our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. Therefore, my dearly loved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. And remember who he's talking to. People that are going back to their old ways. And he says, no. You have to come back to what you've learned. You have to stay steadfast. You cannot be influenced by the culture and do what they're doing. Why? Because our hope is that Messiah will come back and we will be lifted up and will be changed to be able to go into eternity with him. And then in chapter 16, what he's talking about is they're receiving an offering that's going to be sent to Jerusalem. Remember that in Jerusalem is the Sanhedrin, and in Jerusalem is the people that are the apostles, the leaders of the Messianic community. And in verse 2 where he says, on the first day of the week, let each one of you set something aside, saving up whatever is gain. Remember that the first day of the week is the day that as soon as Shabbat ends, starts the first day of the week, which we call Sunday. Because remember that they would meet for Shabbat, and afterwards they would deal with money. During Shabbat, they didn't deal with money. And then he says that he's hoping to go and see them, but he's going to wait till Shavuot. He's in Ephesus writing this letter, but he has Timothy that he has sent to greet them and to see what's going on. And then in verse 13 he says, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith. Be men of courage, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. And he mentions several people that are believers that have helped him and that are part of the community, and they should be also favored and blessed because of what they're doing as leaders within the community. And so he goes on and talks about other people, and then he says, greet one another with a holy kiss. That was the greeting among them. So that was recognized as something that was just between the believers and Messiah. And then he says that at one point he wrote with his own hand. Remember that Paul had difficulty seeing. For some reason he had some issue with his eyes. And so he writes here to make sure that everybody knows that it is him who's doing this letter. And with that, we finish the letter of 1 Corinthians. And so we'll do some questions at this point.